This is a by revision video. What I mean is that I assume that you've already gone through all the content either in lessons or watching my excellent videos already, and this is just a chance for you to go over some of the key topics, some of the key evaluations before either an end of topic test or the real exam. So what I'm going to do is not spend massive amounts of time going over any one topic in particular. If you need that, as I say, go back through the videos, but as a really quick overview, and I'm going to go through this, the specification, and I've already gone through that on my videos, but what you need to know is the origins of psychology, including Wundt, the different approaches to the learning approaches, behaviourist and social learning, cognitive approach, the biological approach, not biopsychology, that's separate, psychodynamic approach, humanistic approach, and some sort of comparison of approaches. So, looking at the origins of psychology, what you need to know. You need to know that psychology is the study of mind and behaviour. You need to know that psychology has developed from early philosophical understanding, so thinking about human thinking and behaviour rather than actually experimenting onto it, following through to Wundt, who was one of the first psychologists who actually did start testing things, and then it's led to kind of more modern day psychology with the different approaches, all of those that I've mentioned before. You need to know a bit more detail about Wundt, who he was, what he did. He opened the first psychology lab in Leipzig in Germany. He was the first one to put scientific study around looking at human thinking and behaviour. He looked at things such as reaction time and sensation and perception. He did this using things such as presenting people with tones or something such as a metronome, and he broke these sensations down into different structures, which is called structuralism, and he asked people what they felt, what they thought, their emotions, their feelings when they were doing this. This is known as introspection, looking in at oneself. There are issues with this, obviously, we know about these days, in that this is quite a subjective thing to do, but what this did lead to is a better understanding of psychology as a science. So the idea of replication, that you could repeat those methods, giving people metronomes and ask them how they felt. That you could use the empirical methods, which is objectivity, observation, using a systematic method that could be replicated, and that led to some of the later approaches in psychology that you should be more well aware of. The origins is less likely to be a 16 marker, but AQA wouldn't surprise me because it's hard to evaluate. You're more likely to get questions about psychology being a science, and Wilhelm Wundt and his methods himself. Next, looking at the behaviourist approach, one of the or learning theory, one of the most well-known theories in psychology. Two halves, really. You've got classical conditioning. You should be well aware of Pavlov's dog. So this is the idea of an unconditioned stimulus leading to an unconditional response, a neutral stimulus leading to no response. The big thing here is those two things being paired. The unconditioned stimulus being paired with a neutral stimulus. That then leads to the unconditioned response. If they're paired enough times, and that the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response becomes the conditioned response, and then you can apply that to several things like Pavlov with his dogs and salivation. If you've gone through the rest of the course, maybe Dollard and Miller, you could apply this to a child learning to attach to its mother. Any numerous other applications. The other side of the learning theory is operant conditioning. This is learning through reward and punishment. You need to know that a reward is getting something that you want to get, and a punishment is getting something that you don't want. You're more likely to do a behaviour if you get a reward or a reinforcement. You're less likely to do a behaviour if you get a punishment. And the terms positive and negative in this situation refer to something being added, positive, or taken away, negative. So you can get a positive reinforcement, something added that you want, like a sweet, a gold star. You could get a positive punishment, so something added that you don't want, a smack or being told off. You could get a negative reinforcer. That's a bit of a weird thing. Negative sounds bad, but it just means something being taken away that you want taken away, such as not getting shouted at, or an electric shock in the case of Skinner's box with the rats. Or you can get a negative punishment, something taken away that you don't want taken away, your phone or your time, such as in a detention. To evaluate the behaviourist approach then, the strengths are that it is quite a scientific approach. It's all those things that I mentioned before with Wundt. It's observable, it's measurable, it's replicable, it's easy to test with animals and with humans, and it's been applied. These things are applied all the time. Training pets, training children, schools, prisons. There's something called the token economy, where if people do well, they're rewarded with a star that can then add up and they can exchange it for prizes. That's a really good application. And then you've got treatments as well. And again, if you've studied the rest of the course, you will know that the behaviourist approach can be used in lots of different treatments, systematic desensitization, for example, in phobias. So that's really good application. You can use this in a 16 marker for your AO3. However, not all great. It's fairly environmentally determinist. What that means is that it says that you're going to end up in a certain way, and there's not a great deal you can do about it. And that's an issue and debate. Again, if you've done the whole course, you'll know what that is, and you can use that as an evaluation. There's potentially issues with the ethics of some of the studies that were done into the rats and the dogs, and there are issues as well. There are obviously numerous other evaluations you can use, but as a quick overview, maybe just before an assessment, that should sort you 3 or 4 good AO3 points that you can peel and elaborate. Should do you well. Going on then and looking at social learning theory. Is classed in behaviourists, it's still behaviourism. When we talk about operant and classical conditioning, that's known as direct learning, it's happening to you. Social learning is indirect, so you're seeing other people doing it. Lots of key terms here, so we've got imitation, identification, modelling, vicarious reinforcement, and cognitive mediational processes. Imitation, copying the behaviour of a role model. Modelling, another term there, someone that you look up to, someone demonstrating a behaviour. Identification is where you're more likely to imitate or model someone who's similar to you, so someone of a similar age, someone of a similar gender, and so that has an impact on social learning. Vicarious reinforcement, different to the reinforcement we were talking about before. So positive and negative reinforcement happen to you, vicarious reinforcement happens to someone else. So if you see someone else getting rewarded for doing a behaviour, you might observe that and think, oh, I want that reward, you do that behaviour as well. Or the other side, you might see someone getting punished and think, I don't want that, so you won't do that behaviour. Cognitive mediational processes are what happens between observing the behaviour and actually carrying it out. It's not saying that we just observe something, think I want that, and do it automatically. There's a bit of thinking that goes on. The factors that you need to be aware of are attention. Have you paid attention to it? Retention, do you remember it? Reproduction, can you physically do that? And motivation, do you want to do that? And that obviously happens between, as I said, observing the action and carrying it out. A really famous study in social learning theory is Bandura's Bobo doll study. You should be aware of this. This will help you for your AO1 for social learning theory. Children observed a model hitting an inflatable doll. They were then introduced into that same room, and Bandura observed what they did, and what they found is it backed up all those things that we mentioned before. So the children that observed people that were more like themselves, identification, were more likely to imitate them, so a male observing a male, female observing a female, and they found that the children did hit the doll as well. Big applications here if you study the aggression topic in year 13, because this is again another key study. So yeah, really important study here. Evaluation of social learning theory, so much like the learning theory, strengths and weaknesses. The strengths are applications again, so we can apply this to things such as crime. So if we do know that youths have committed crimes, then maybe we can pair them up with a more positive role model to try and change their behaviour. Another good application is that social learning theory allows us to explain cultural variations, so why maybe one society eat one sort of food and another eat another sort of food. Well, are we just observing that from the environment around us? That's a good application. Again, another link to another topic. This is why the approaches topic is actually quite a good one, because it does summarise all the other ones. There's also research support for the role of identification. This was Fox and Baylinson. They asked people to play video games of avatars that looked like themselves or not, doing exercise, and what they found was the people that played with an avatar that looked more like themselves doing exercise were then more likely to do exercise themselves in the real world. So this shows that identification, because it was like them, they were more likely to do it. It supports the role of the social learning theory. Not all great, however. There is the issue of cause and effect. So if we say, okay, well, the reason why one child has committed a crime, stolen something, is because they were hanging about with people who were stealing things, they copied their behaviour. Well, not always. Could they have just been hanging about with those people because they were the thieves and they identified with those other people? It's not because they observed them, so that is their cause and effect there. There's also tends to be a bit of an over-reliance on lab studies in the social learning theory. Look at Bandura, for example. So that was quite a contrived setup. Is that actually applicable to real world? Is hitting an inflatable doll like real life aggression? Well, probably not. Real life people can hit back. There was also a researcher called Noble who overheard children saying, "Oh, look, there's the doll I have to hit," when they went in. So actually, were they measuring, as demand characteristics there, were they measuring aggression, or was it just the setup of the environment of the study that made them be aggressive? So there's a bit of an issue there. The other point, and this is a really good thing that you can do for any of the approaches in the approaches topic, is you can compare one approach against another, because any one approach would probably go against the other. In this case, can we say that maybe biological factors would also have a role to play in things like being aggressive or being a criminal? Well, aggression, testosterone has a big role to play. There's neurological issues as well, and so we can't just say that social learning theory is the only thing that's explaining any sort of human thinking or behaviour. And remember, that's what you're doing with any approach. Next up is the cognitive approach, and this deals with what's known as internal mental processes. So that basically means what's going on in your head in terms of thinking, perception, memory, attention, processing, retrieval, etc., etc., etc. Again, lots of key terms here. So yeah, internal mental processes. We've got inference. That's quite a key one. They like asking questions on that. Cognitive psychologists need to make inferences. We can't see the processes that are going on, but based on research evidence, we can make logical assumptions. So, for example, we know that the capacity of short-term memory is 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information, because we've given people loads of information, and that's on average how much they can hold. So that we infer from that the capacity is 7 plus or minus 2. Schemas are like packets of information. They're how we categorize our information in our mind, and we chunk the information together, clump it together. And then you've got cognitive neuroscience, and this is where you pair the thinking processes with neural imaging, so we can know what areas are active during certain processes, such as perception and attention and memory and things like that. And so you get a better idea of the areas in the brain that are activated, and you do that through fMRI or PET scans, etc. It's going to be applied to lots of different areas, again, through the rest of the spec. Memory is a big area that uses cognitive influences, as well as psychopathology, talking about how we explain mental health disorders, etc. Evaluations of this, so lots of applications here. Already mentioned psychopathology. So if we can explain a disorder through the cognitive approach, then we can maybe treat it that way. So Beck, for example. Also, there's a lot of work at the moment into artificial intelligence, and if we can know about human thinking processes, that might help, and the cognitive approach will help with that. The cognitive approach tends to use, because of the inferences, a lot of experimental methods, lab studies, for example. You've got, Peterson and Miller and Barrick and Badley, and they tend to do lots of research, experimental research into psychology, which is great, and it gets us some good empirical, observable evidence. And it also tends to be less deterministic than some of the other approaches we mentioned. So I'll mention biological in a moment. We've already mentioned the learning approaches, which are environmentally deterministic. Well, at least the cognitive approach says that we're free to choose our own thoughts. Not all plain sailing, as nothing is, and there are issues here. So by using models, computer models, to explain human behaviour. That can obviously, it reduces, it's potentially reductionistic, reduces human thinking and behaviour down into two simplistic parts. It also tends to ignore motivation or emotion. It just looks, again, a bit like humans as a bit of a computer and just processing information rather than actually explain the full human experience, which includes emotion. And quite often we have poor external validity because of that high control in the lab studies, which is great, but it sometimes means that the stimulus that we use are artificial, and so we can't actually say that this has good external validity. Moving on then, you've got the biological approach. Now this is difficult because you're obviously going to have the biopsychology section in paper 2 along with the approaches section, but it's still worth knowing that the biological approach is an approach in itself. Things to be aware of are genes, genotype and phenotype, evolution, neurochemistry and biological structures. So looking at genes, we've got inheritance and twin studies. Twin studies again are used in lots of the other topics, and we look at the difference between monozygotic and dizygotic twins, and we look at concordant traits, and that generally tells us what proportion of any given condition or behaviour can be attributed to biological factors, give or take a bit of environment. You've also got the difference between the genotype and phenotype. So genotype is the particular genes that are inherited, phenotype is the expression of those genes based on the environment as well. And then you've got evolution, and again lots of different approaches use an evolutionary approach, but this from a basic model looks at inheritance and survival of the fittest. So it's saying that any psychological thing that we have at the moment, any way we think or behave, probably had some sort of evolutionary advantage. It allowed us to survive in our environment, whether that's taste preferences in eating, whether it's being aggressive, whether it's our approach to relationships. We can link that back to survival of the fittest and natural selection, and the evolutionary approach. There's also the neurochemistry that you need to be aware of, the different neurons, the makeup of a neuron with axons and synapses, and the fight or flight response you need to be aware of as well. That comes under the biological approach. Evaluation to the biological approach then, well, it is probably the most scientific methods. There is lots of use of MRIs, fMRIs, very, very scientific. It is a science, obviously, biology, and so it's highly replicable, observable, measurable, etc. There's also really good application here. We go back to the psychopathology approach, and you can give people drugs for different sorts of disorders. If we understand the neurochemistry, SSRIs for example, we can then use our understanding from the biological approach to help in applications. Issues, well, the evolutionary approach is potentially unfalsifiable. We can't prove that the reason we have our thinking and behaviour is because it did provide an adaptive advantage. We can make guesses, but we can't actually be there and prove it. And again, you've got this big issue of determinism. Biology is obviously biologically deterministic. It's saying you are the way you are because of your genes, and if that's the case, is there anything you can do about it? If that is true, though, can we then blame people if they are aggressive? Because they can just say they've inherited it, or it's their level of testosterone, it's not their fault. So there's a bit of an issue there. And again, you can potentially, another evaluative point I haven't got here, but you can compare the biological approach to maybe some of the other approaches, cognitive, behavioural, and I'm about to go on to psychodynamic and humanistic. Next is everyone's favourite Freud and the psychodynamic approach. Lots of key principles. Again, key terminology. Terminology is really, really important, obviously, across psychology and especially in the approaches topic. So you've got the areas of the mind, the conscious, the pre-conscious, and the unconscious. You've got the areas of personality, id, which is the pleasure principle, ego, which is the reality principle, and the superego, which is the morality principle. And then you've got your defense mechanisms. So you've got repression, pushing unwanted thoughts down into the unconscious. You've got denial, which is flat out not believing it, and then you've got displacement, which is putting unwanted thoughts onto what's seen as more acceptable other areas. And then you've got the psychosexual stages: the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital stage. OAPs like grapes. And all of these kind of things in common. They say that the childhood is really important, conflict. So if you have conflict in your childhood, that's what leads to mental health problems later on. They get housed in your unconscious, that get repressed down, and they lead to later issues. And to get rid of your issues, you need to kind of deal with that and have some sort of psychosexual help. There is a case study, so there's the Little Hans study. 5-year-old boy, Freud used this to support his psychosexual stages, particularly the phallic stage, and he dreamed of horses and thought it was his dad, and it all gets a bit weird. You've then got evaluations, so strengths, as I've already mentioned. The therapy, psychoanalysis, has been found to work, still used to this day, and so there's good application of this theory. It also has some explanatory power in terms of development, psychological development of children, as I mentioned, psychosexual stages. Also, explanation of abnormality. It can explain why we have mental health problems, OCD, for example, housed in the unconscious. The issues, case studies. There's a problem with using case studies because there are so few people. You can't generalize them. There's a bit of subjectivity there. Little Hans's dad reported him to Freud. Is there subjectivity in that? It's also a very unfalsifiable approach. It's very hard to test some of these things. You can just say, oh, it's in the unconscious, and you can't access that. Well, if you can't access it, there's no way of testing it, there's no way of knowing if that's correct or not. And it's also quite a deterministic view. It says that all these things are in the unconscious, and this is just the way it is, and it's hard to fight against it if you just say, oh well, repressing it or denying it is actually almost a sign of it happening. So that's an issue. Leading on to the more positive humanistic approach, and this came out of dissatisfaction with some of the other approaches from Maslow and Rogers, and some key aspects to this is free will, the idea that we have more control over our lives. So we'll mention on a few of these approaches: biological, behaviorists, psychodynamic. They are deterministic in one way or another. Well, free will is the other side to that. So it's suggesting that actually we have more control over our lives. It's known as being the person-centered approach. Couple of key areas, obviously the hierarchy of needs here, really important, and you've got the different levels that you move up: physiological at the bottom, then safety, love and belonging, self-esteem, and finally self-actualization, which is what Maslow said that we were all striving towards, to be the best possible version of ourselves. #living my best life, and that's where we need to be aiming towards. There was also the idea of congruence. This is the link between the ideal self and the perceived self, how you see yourself, how you see yourself wanting to be. If there's high overlap there, you're good, you're congruent, and you have a happy, healthy life. If there's a big gap between those two things, you're known as being incongruent, and there's an issue. Other terms here: unconditional positive regard, which is what a parent should show. They shouldn't show conditions of worth. I'll only love you if X, Y, and Z. And so again, when we start looking at the evaluation, there's a bit of therapy here. Humanistic therapy aims to close that gap, and the therapist should show unconditional positive regard to their clients. So, as I said, least reductionist, most free will approach. It is a positive approach. I mentioned it just has some application as well. However, other than the counselling, it's hard to know where these theories can fit into real life, and this is quite unfalsifiable as well. The idea of self-actualization and congruence are intangible. It's hard to test, hard to pinpoint those things. It's also quite a culturally biased approach. It puts you at the centre of the world. Well, that's a very Western view. Eastern cultures don't hold that view. They're more collectivist and actually would say that looking at yourself is not, on looking at being the best version of yourself is not a healthy thing to do. Last and not least, but actually probably most importantly, because I think this is how quite a likely 60 mark it, is the comparison of approaches. So this is good for the exam board because it means they can test more or one or more of these approaches. It's a 60 mark. It can really test your ability, and you need to know there's a lot of exam technique in here. You need to know how to approach these things. The other difficult thing for you and good thing for the exam board is there's not an unlimited number of possibilities, but there are a healthy number, and too many for you to probably do each of them and learn them and try and spit them out in the exam. So a better approach for you to take is to figure out the skill that you need, how you're going to approach these, practice a couple, and then apply that in the exam. And that's a better way to do it. So learn the method, learn the exam technique. So the technique is you need to find some comparisons and be able to compare any two of the approaches against them. And there are some specific things that you should be focusing on, and they're here. So consciousness, each of the different approaches takes a different view on consciousness, and if you can compare two against each other, that would be really good. Development, by that I mean child development. So each approach takes a different view to how a child develops. So social learning says it's through the environment and observing others. Freud would say it's through these set stages. Emotion, so each of the different approaches takes a different approach to emotion. As I said before, cognitive takes hardly any approach, whereas the humanistic might place a bit more focus on your own emotion. These next two are really important. So the approach they take to mental health. How does this approach, if you're looking at the behaviourist approach, how does it explain mental health disorders compared to maybe the biological approach? They're both quite different. And then, and this is almost 2 for 1, you can use this as a separate thing, how does that then lead to treatment? So if you're viewing mental health disorder in one way, then obviously the treatment's going to follow, but that's going to be a separate evaluative point. Determinism, again, I've pretty much mentioned determinism in all of these. You've got environmental determinism for the behaviourist, you've got biological determinism for biological, and a lot of free will for the humanistic. So can you compare these two approaches against each other in terms of determinism? Psychology is a science. What approach does the approach take to explaining to finding evidence? So is it experiments or is it more case studies, and can you compare those against each other? Or there are lots of other things, so any of the issues in debate, nature and nurture, nomothetic, ideographic, etc, etc, etc. Just make sure you compare each side to one another. So that was a really whistle-stop tour. I know there'll be areas in there that you maybe need to go into more detail. If that's the case, that's fine. Go back to the video, go back to your textbook, and look over that in more detail. This was just to make sure, quick whistle-stop tour, as I said, to cover the whole specification. I assume you're doing this before an assessment, as I said, end of topic test or the actual exam. If you are, best of luck.